afternoon, or evening, ladies, gentlemen, and everybody. Welcome to another spanking new episode of the Classic English Literature Podcast. I hope you're all doing splendidly. Now that's a word I should like to use more often, splendid. So I will be trying to work it into my everyday vocabulary. It's just such a pleasant word, isn't it? Splendid. I'm still looking for your advice and preferences for how to approach William Shakespeare on the podcast. Let me know what you'd like to hear by emailing at classicenglishLiterature, that's all one word, classicenglishLiterature@gmail.com, or you can shoot me a message on the Instabook or the TwitTalk. Thank you very much to those who already have. I appreciate the feedback, and I'm looking forward to hearing some more opinions. One more thing, before we give rhyme its reason today, I need to offer you a mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I was quite sloppy in our latest subcast episode on Chaucer's Miller's Tale and the mystery plays. I mistranslated one of the Middle English passages. I'm really sorry about that. Usually, I write out the translations to ensure some degree of accuracy anyway, but for that episode, for some reason, I translated on the fly, and away my accuracy flew. Here is the offended passage. It's Absalom's serenade to Alison. Quote, "He singeth in his voice gentle and small. Now, dear lady, if there will be, I pray you that you wolla rue on me." Now, I believe I garbled the last line as something like, "I pray you will be true to me," which is utter nonsense, dear listener. I know that now. I should have known it then. I misread the Middle English word rue as true in my head, and the balderdash just spilled out. Rua, of course, is pity. Think of our word ruthless, which means something like without pity. So a better translation of Absalom's plaint to Alison is, "I pray that you will have pity on me. As I do you, friend listener, I beg your forgiveness." My soul feels lighter. Thank you. I hope that my honesty has earned your approbation, so may I ask that you take a moment to like and subscribe to the podcast. A posted positive review would assure me of your forgiveness, as well as make the podcast more visible on platforms for new listeners. If you'd like to help me keep the lights on and the mic hot, please consider a small donation by clicking the Support the Show button on the upper right-hand corner of the Buzzsprout homepage. I really do appreciate your indulgence. Whew. All right. Today, we begin a bit of a transitional period in the podcast. Now, roughly speaking, we've hit about the year 1500 in our historical survey. And around this time, the culture of Northern Europe, including England, begins to undergo a major shift in its worldview. I am, of course, talking about the Renaissance, that period in which the glorious light of ancient Greece and Rome is reborn to scatter the darkness of a benighted medieval world. I don't believe a word of that. But it is the popular impression, though I hope our little talks have helped to convince you of its outrageous mendacity. But we do like our tidy little timelines, don't we? Neat dates that carve up history into bite-sized pieces. 450 to 1066, Anglo-Saxon period. 1066 to 1485, the Middle Ages. 1485 to 1660, the Renaissance and the early modern period. Would that eternity were so neatly divisible. Of course it's not. But we do have to admit that the times change, attitudes change, and if such dates give us a bit of a handle on the amorphous shifts in the Weltanschauung, who am I to complain? We usually ballpark the end of the Middle Ages to around 1500. Actually, 1485 is the preferred date in English history, because it's the year that Richard III thoughtlessly misplaced his horse at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry Tudor became Henry VII, the Winter King, the first Tudor monarch. So, give or take a Tuesday, we'll say that the podcast is entering the English Renaissance. So, today's poet, John Skelton, he's a good guy to start with. He's a transitional figure. The last medieval poet or the first Tudor poet? Who can say? Equally contested is his stature. He has been called the first great Tudor poet. Critic John M. Burden called Skelton, quote, the greatest poet to have been born in the 15th century. But other poets, Alexander Pope, for instance, derided him as beastly. Skelton, I feel, is pretty obscure now, even to English majors. In fact, when I was doing some research for this episode, I opened up my own copy of the Oxford Anthology that was assigned for my undergraduate British Literature survey, and I was surprised to find that I had annotations for the Skelton excerpts. I don't even remember reading them. Now, granted, my college years were, well, nearly antediluvian, and the professor I had was not a paragon of pedagogy. At the beginning of the semester, he would hand you an exhaustive syllabus. It detailed all the readings, the quiz dates, the prompts for essays, and their due dates. He directed you helpfully to the campus bookstore to purchase the Oxford doorstop, and then he left you to your own devices for the next 14 weeks. He sat in the front of the room reading the New York Times, figuring if you had a question, you'd ask it. Otherwise, he presumed your competence. Not a great teacher. But I did enjoy his company, actually. I really liked him. Occasionally, during free blocks around lunchtime, we would slip off to the local bar, fetchingly called The Dog, drink Rolling Rock long necks, and we'd talk about our favorite TV shows. Northern Exposure was a particular favorite at the time. I didn't learn a great deal of Brit Lit from this guy, but I did do a fair amount of day drinking, which I think you'll agree most undergraduates would prefer. Anyway, my original point was that Skelton is, for most poetry readers, at best a minor writer and at worst completely unknown. Which is too bad, because he's kind of an impressive guy. Born in the 1460s, his scholarly reputation was already sufficient enough that William Caxton, the first English printer, referred to it in 1490, recalling, quote, Master Skelton's poet laureateship, a degree in rhetoric. Skelton also tutored the young Prince Henry, he that would go on to become Henry VIII with his clutch of wives, and Skelton certainly knew upon which side his bread was buttered. In the poem Laud and Praise Made for Our Sovereign Lord the King, written around 1409 at the accession of the most notorious of English monarchs.
No.
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Holly Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Holly Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
1509. First the mistranslation, and now this. Who left you in charge of a podcast anyway? You're on my list.
Skelton lays the groundwork for what would become the Tudor myth. It is a tour de force of sycophancy. Now, no judgment here. Nascent tyrants should be stroked if you want to stay intact. Bit of advice. The young dynasty under the new king, appointed by God's grace to quell the land's chaos after the Wars of the Roses, now all is equanimity. Quote, The rose, both white and red, in one rose now doth grow. Thus thorough every stead thereof the fame doth blow. Grace the seed did sow, England now gathers flowers, exclude now all dolors. Noble Henry VIII, thy loving sovereign lord, of king's line most straight his title doth record. John, you got a little something there? Brownish? No, on your nose. There you go. Good man. So the white rose of the Yorks and the red rose of the Lancasters now firmly grow in one Tudor rose, a rose with both red and white petals, if you've never seen the symbol. But while quite conscious of the value of tradition, both politically and literarily, Skelton would prove to be one of the more inventive poets in the language. Now, to be fair, much of his work stays within the lanes established by medieval literary tradition. He wrote dream allegories like The Garland of Laurel, which has antecedents in Langland, Gower, and Chaucer. His satirical poem, Colin Clout, which points out the corruption of the church and aristocracy, is in the vein of much anti-clerical literature of the age, like Piers Plowman, and it's spoken by a representative of the peasant class. He even wrote a morality play, Magnificence, that, kind of like Mallory's Mort, offered a prescription for the proper behavior of the royal court and aristocracy. So, in that way, certainly a man of the medieval tradition. But his metrical skill and ingenuity points the way forward at a time when Chaucer's introduction of the iambic pentameter line had begun to fall out of fashion, and if I'm honest, much verse of the 15th century is hardly remarkable. Skelton experimented with short, clipped lines with a curt, punchy rhythm. We now call his style skeltonics. In general, a skeltonic line contains 2 or 3 stressed syllables, often emphasized by alliteration, with a single rhyme pattern. And he usually does it over 2 to 4 lines, but actually sometimes he goes up to 14. Anaphora, or the repeating of a word at the beginning of successive clauses, also makes frequent appearances. Here's an oft anthologized example, a genial blazon of feminine virtues. It's called To Mistress Margaret Hussey. Quote, Mary Margaret as midsummer flower, gentle as a falcon or hawk of the tower, with solace and gladness, much mirth and no madness, all good and no badness, so joyously, so maidenly, so womanly, her demeaning in everything far, far passing that I can indite, or suffice to write of Mary Margaret, as midsummer flower, gentle as falcon or hawk of the tower, as patient and still, and as full of good will as fair Isaphil, coriander, sweet pomander, good Cassander, steadfast of thought, well made, well wrought, far may be sought ere that ye can find so courteous, so kind as Mary Margaret, this midsummer flower, gentle as falcon or hawk of the tower. James VI called this style a tumbling verse, for the rhythm does kind of seem to tumble off the page. The effect of the meter varies depending on the context of the poem, but I think it's this brusque, frenetic style that led writer George Putnam to complain of Skelton's rude railing. Now, rude in this case meaning unsophisticated, not necessarily bawdy. Critics note that in some ways, Skelton points toward later Elizabethan and 18th century poets like Edmund Spenser, the aforementioned Pope, and Thomas Gray, whose Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes, from the 1740s, finds its antecedent in the poem that today's episode will focus on, and that's Skelton's The Book of Phillip Sparrow. Phillip Sparrow is what we call a mock elegy. That is, it's a poem of serious reflection, an elegy, the subject of which is ill-suited to the genre. Now, this poem commemorates the death of a young girl's pet sparrow, named Philip, at the paws of the vicious cat Gib. Skelton posits the young girl, Jane Scroop, being educated at Norwich's Carrow Abbey, as the speaker officiating at the funeral of her lost bird. The poem borrows heavily from the Office of the Dead, the Roman Catholic liturgical prayers for the repose of the soul. At the beginning, Jane speaks of the circumstances of Philip's death, begs that his soul be remembered in the telling of the rosary, details her great grief, and recalls pleasant memories. About halfway through part 1, Jane launches a vicious diatribe against cats with a disturbing catalog, really disturbing, of the punishments and tortures she wishes would befall them. There follows an imagined congregation of the entire avian kingdom, kind of like a state funeral, I guess. And finally, Jane offers to produce an epitaph for poor Philip, But before doing so, she goes on a digressive listing of all the writers she has and has not read, asserting her maid-like humility. Thus ends part 1 of the poem. Now, parts 2 and 3, which will not concern us today, concern Skelton's ruminations on young Jane's beauty, and then an explanation of why such was necessary, respectively. But let's look at the very beginning of the lament. Here are the first few lines. Quote, Placebo. Who is there? Who? Dilexi. Dame Marjorie. Fa, re, mi. Wherefore and why? The first line, which is the word placebo, but it's broken up into 3 separate phonemes, as is the third line, dilexi, and they come from the antiphon and the psalm of Vespers of the Office of the Dead, like I said. Now, dividing the syllables in this way kind of suggests plain chant, or maybe you know it as Gregorian chant. They mean, by the way, I will please and I love, respectively. Now, Dame Marjorie of Carrow Abbey, the scene of the crime, the locus in quo, is present. Line 5, fa, re, mi. Now, it sounds like nonsense until you realize that these are musical notes. Finally, lines 2 and 6, pained interrogatives, alliterate the H and W sounds of the letter W. All of this strikes me as way ahead of its time. I think there's something proto-modernist here. The fragmented syllables and the musical scale indicating song, and then you got the macaronic verse, the ritual illusion, the letter W doing sonic double duty. You got an implied listener, the sense of despair, the near stream of consciousness voicing. I could easily see T.S. Eliot writing like this. I don't think it'd be out of place in The Wasteland or in something by Ezra Pound. I'd believe you if you told me it was written in 1908 or 1928, not 1508. Yet, Skelton also deftly manages to have the versification underscore the youth and innocence of the speaker. Right? It can have kind of a nursery rhyme feel that reminds the reader of Jane's girlhood. Now, as a sidebar, we don't know how old Jane Scroop was when bereft of poor Pip the Sparrow. The poem could have been written no later than 1508, as a guy named Alexander Barclay scoffed at it in his adaptation of Sebastian Brant's Ship of Fools in 1509. Jane Scroop's birth date remains unknown, so it's altogether possible that she was not a child when her pet died. But Skelton's rhythmic choices clearly present her as one, and one for whom the death is a monumental event. Now, this brings up a tension between the implied juvenescence of the speaker and the astounding learnedness she displays. Not only is this putative child familiar enough with the Office of the Dead to adapt it, she dazzles us with repeated and copious allusions to classical mythology, world geography, Catholic liturgy, natural philosophy, Stoicism, history, and literature. To be sure, the bulk of her text consists of these displays of knowledge. And nor do they appear half-digested or ill-remembered as one might expect from so fresh a mind. The poem also handily uses rhetorical strategies like demonstration, exclamation, and digression. Now remember, rhetoric, of course, is Skelton's jam. So is this all just Skelton flexing? I wouldn't discount the charge. And I don't mean to be dismissive or indeed disrespectful. I don't want to appear as if I'm pointing out a major gaffe in Skelton's poem. I mean, I know I personally don't like it when my own students, because they don't understand a text, they charge the text with being impenetrable rather than reflecting on their own, perhaps, insensitivity to its nuances. So I admit maybe I'm falling into that very trap. But I do have a hard time resolving what strikes me as a major aporia: Skelton's ironic tone and Jane's earnest grief. As I said, it's a mock elegy, and the mock part gets its power from the fact that such intense feeling and solemn ritual are expended on the trivial death of a bird. Jane recalls, quote, When I remember again how my Philip was slain, never half the pain was between you twain, Pyramus and Thisbe, as then befell to me. Now, Pyramus and Thisbe, you may recall, are the ill-fated lovers from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and they commit suicide when they think their beloved is dead. And this, of course, is a main source for Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So I suppose we're meant to smile knowingly at the child's hyperbolic grief. Again, quote, I sighed and I sobbed, for that I was robbed of my sparrow's life. O maiden, widow, and wife, of what estate ye be, of high or low degree, great sorrow then you might see, and learn to weep at me. But here's why I don't smile indulgently. Because the loss of a pet is often a child's first experience with death, the first move from innocence to experience. The poem, from Jane's point of view, marks a significant coming-of-age event, and of course this can trigger psychopathological symptoms that can recur for years. And Jane is, physically, too, coming of age. I don't want to dwell too much on it, because psychosexual readings of literature often conceal more than they reveal. But we shouldn't overlook Jane's references to, quote, my breast's soft, and the curious sexual undertones to Phillip Sparrow, who was, quote, wont to repair and go in at my spare and creep in at my gore. Now that word gore is a bit rich. Its primary meaning is, of course, like thick clotted blood. And it's also a verb, right? To pierce or to penetrate or to stab. But it also comes from an Old English word, gara, that meant a triangular piece of ground, which came from an Old Frisian word for a piece of cloth, especially a three-cornered one sewn into the front of a skirt. So, putting all this together, we do get the sense of a girl undergoing puberty. And so at the moment of sexual maturity and its physical manifestations, Jane also undergoes a consequential psychological blow. So let's take a look at the persona of the poem and try to suss out what she may be doing. Now, she's presiding over a funeral using the office of the dead, and I think there are two things going on here psychologically. One, Jane is imitating the behavior of adults, what psychologists would call modeling. Modeling allows children not only to learn the modes of being and behavior expected in a given culture, but it also fosters in them a sense of identity and belonging. It's a socializing behavior. And in this particular case, in which grief and anger are central emotions, such a sense of belonging would mitigate those powerful emotions, channeling the responses into ritual expurgations. And this seems to be a universal human behavior, probably rooted in some hardwired genetics and not the byproduct of a particular environment. Furthermore, the fact that those rituals exist, like the Office of the Dead, provides a framework allowing Jane to situate her loss in a larger system of signification. Her feelings cease being abstract and untethered. Right? Instead, the prayers and the ritual give those feelings significance. They give them meaning. Now, experiential meaning is the sine qua non of mental health and maturity. Additionally, we notice that Jane frequently anthropomorphizes the animals involved. That is, she gives animals human characteristics and behaviors. Phillip Sparrow wore a velvet cap and, quote, learned after my school how to behave properly. She teaches him. It's just more modeling. Jane gives Gib the cat agency. Quote, that cat specially that slew so cruelly my pretty little sparrow. She presumes a motive and intention beyond mere instinctual hunger. In an apostrophe, Jane curses, quote, O cat of carlish kind, the fiend was in thy mind when thou my bird untwined. Again, agency, motive, with a dash of demon possession, evidently. In the state funeral part with the birds, she casts the robin as a priest. The popinjay will read the gospel, and the mavis will read an epistle. Puffins and teals will distribute alms to the poor. Of course, this type of thing is not unknown to us. The bulk of children's entertainment today features anthropomorphic animals. Think Disney. But why do we do this? To imagine the minds of others, to evade a solipsistic conception of the world. As such, anthropomorphizing helps children, and most adults, I would venture. You talk to your dog. Yes, you do. Anthropomorphizing helps foster connectedness to others, which cultivates empathy while reducing anxiety. We can make better sense of complex events. In 1890, psychologist and philosopher William James delineated the distinction between I and me. Now, using a grammatical metaphor, he defined the me as the self as object. That is, how one reflects about oneself, the descriptors one would use to describe oneself, something of a detached appraisal, seeing yourself perhaps the way others would see you. He defined the I as the self as subject. Here, one perceives oneself doing things, being an active agent in the world, capable of self-directed thought and action. Jane's doing all of this in her lament for her lost pet. She embraces a ritual and verbal framework that gives significance to her experience and then models the behavior of adults to activate that framework. By doing so, she begins to imagine other lives, other minds, other ways of being that allow her to see herself as a self, a unique psychology in the world. And that's what I think is remarkable about this poem. Maybe you didn't even notice because it's so common, so normal for us. But Jane speaks in the first person, the I, and articulates her emotional, physical, and spiritual experience from the position of a unique, conscious being. We've not really seen this before in our literature. The closest we've gotten may be the Anglo-Saxon elegies, but I don't feel the same psychological intimacy with those speakers as I do with young Jane's persona. Jane is not a figure of bathos to be condescendingly patted on the head with a cooing, "Aw, isn't she cute? Poor girl, they're so dramatic at this age." This is the thinking I. And this, I would argue, is really where that shift in the Weltanschauung begins. This recognition of an inchoate, singular self underlies the philosophy of humanism, which will steadily erode the hegemony of the medieval world as it clutches toward modernity. We'll talk more about these ideas next time and the times after. For now, be well, be safe, and I'll talk to you next time.